And then, of course, the clothes all came off, and it was just money, sex, and just house of ill repute all over the place. But this is where something I often talk about, how men, their first early experience with a dominant woman will hardlock something in their psyche where they become forever addicted to that intoxicating mix of a woman, a strong, beautiful woman, overpowering them, dominating them, telling them what to do. Hi, my name is Pamela. I am professionally known as the Violatrix. I am a 20-year findom. I am on TikTok at Saint2 Siren. I am the author of the Ultimate Financial Domination Guide, which, just so you know, I'm going to give my big disclaimer here. This book is not the salacious backstory. That's episode 3 that I'm filming today. That's what you're about to hear. This book is a guide for the women who found me on TikTok, who asked me to come out from the shadows to explain how I do what I do so that they too could learn how to do it. Much to my shock, it was women from all walks of life. It wasn't just young girls who wanted to learn. It was like Wall Street executives, doctors, lawyers. I was very surprised. So my next book will have the salacious backstory. I'm going to touch on a lot of that today, but I also wanted to explain to you who my viewership is, who my followers are, and who this podcast is for. And I have 2 types of clients. I have 2 types of people who follow me. I have the men who want to be dominated, the submissive men. They are alpha by day, corporate executives, doctors, lawyers, famous sports guys, athletes. And then I have the women who follow me, who kind of discovered me, and I grew kind of this cult following out of nowhere, again on TikTok, for the women who want to learn how to do what I do. So I do, on my website, the Violatrix IX, the VIOLATRIX.com, you can book an appointment with me, a consultation, whether you're a woman wanting to do this or whether you're a man who wants to be severely dominated. Today's episode, episode 3, is the Mafia and the sex industry, also known on TikTok as the 304 industry, in case you didn't know. My particular backstory, which was asked of me to reveal my backstory underneath on my podcast on Spotify. You can make comments about my episodes, and I was asked by several women to explain how a nice girl from Hershey, Pennsylvania ends up becoming a global sensation dominatrix. And that's what I'm going to tell you today. I was 33 years old, originally from Hershey, Pennsylvania, a nice Italian-American, both my parents were Italian-American, nice Italian-American girl from a small town, Hershey, and lived a very kind of good girl life. I did what my parents told me to do. I was a rule follower. I'm the youngest of 3. Now, I had decided at the age of 33, after moving back from New Jersey, where I went to college, and I was also a bartender. I was the head bartender at kind of a speakeasy type place. It was mob-controlled, mob-owned, and that was in Englewood, New Jersey. And it was called Smoke. And it was like a 6-seat bar, and it was like a cigar and cognac bar. All the servers were men, and I was the only woman employed in the restaurant as the bartender. So when I left and came back to Pennsylvania, when I left New Jersey, left college, left everything behind, and I got into a corporate career, I had become an admissions director for a college in Pennsylvania. I ended up very quickly rising from admissions representative to director of admissions within less than 2 years. I found great personal and professional success, and I bought 3 rental properties, and I was doing very well for myself. So this was by the age of 33. I had decided I didn't believe in marriage. I didn't want to be married, but I was ready to be a mother. It should have not surprised me that this might not be in sync with my father's vision for my future. So at the age of 33, with my 3 rental properties and my burgeoning corporate career, my father found out that I was pregnant and bankrupted me. And that's the story I'm going to tell you. So I was owning my 3 properties. I was in the middle of showing one of my properties. I was about 7.5 months pregnant, very visible belly. And I'm outside one of my properties. All 3 of my properties were in historical downtown Harrisburg. All 3 of them were in the 100 block. 2 of them were on Riley Street and 1 was on Her Street. And they were absolutely beautiful historicals. If you know anything about Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, there's just amazing history and architecture, and I'm very drawn to those things. I have a love of historical architecture. My father also didn't like that. Growing up in the Marcy Projects in Brooklyn, he hated anything that resembled that. So I'm in front of my house showing one of my properties to a prospective tenant, a really lovely girl, and I hear this, and I flip my head around. I've got a clipboard, I'm pointing at the property, and the girl is like taking it all in, and I turn around, and my father, who's kind of like a cross between like Frankie Avalon and like any of those old like 1940s, 50s singers, like the really cute ones, he's kind of a cross between that and Joe Pesci. That's like the best way I could describe it. And he gets out of his car and he starts screaming and he's spitting and he's biting his knuckle. He's like, I'm going to fucking kill you. I'm going to fucking kill you, you fucking whore. And I'm like, and my eyes pop out of my head and the tenant runs and he starts running towards me. And I've got the clipboard and now I run behind his car and he's kind of chasing me around the car. It was like something out of a movie. It was like Shameless meets The Sopranos meets I don't know what. And he's biting his knuckle and he's spitting and he can't get me because I'm like behind the car. I'm like, what's the problem? And he's like, you're having a baby out of wedlock. I'll fucking ruin you. If you don't terminate this pregnancy, I'll fucking bankrupt you. I'll fucking ruin you. And now bear in mind, I'd never done a single thing wrong in my life. So this was kind of shocking. So as he's trying to chase me and I'm ducking behind the car, people from the PIADA building, which is the Pennsylvania Independent Auto Dealers, whom he used to do their financial planning. My father was on Wall Street. He became a financial planner, had his own practice, his own business for many years, DC Cappetta and Associates. And all these people come out, they're like, someone call the cops. I'm like, that's okay. That's the guy who handles your retirement plan. So at one point, he takes off like his $700 Italian loafer and he chucks it at me and I duck. And he's just still trying to get me to, I think, terminate my pregnancy. It's that part is still really not clear. Fast forward a couple of months, my father had gotten POA over my properties, which means power of attorney. My father was always doing dirty deals with banks, and in this particular case, he had a deal with a bank and needed to bring them business. So he came to me and said, I need power of attorney over your businesses. I was like, why? And he said, because I want to wrap your 3 residential mortgages into a commercial mortgage. It'll benefit you. It'll benefit you, Pammy. And I was like, that doesn't sound like it's going to benefit me. You're taking 3 subprime mortgages with like $400 payments and you're wrapping it into one commercial payment on the first of the month, $3,000 a month. I said, my rentals don't run that way. And he's like, are you questioning me? You're going to fucking do what I told you to do. Okay. So I gave him power of attorney. I had forgotten when I am, standing here 7.5 months pregnant with my properties and the whole thing, I had forgotten I'd given him power of attorney. Fast forward, he did in fact bankrupt me. I lost my homes, all 3 of them, and my car in one fell swoop of his pen. And he ended up selling my homes to the guy who managed, my dad used to own Fuddruckers restaurant in Hershey, Pennsylvania, across from the medical center. And he, strong-armed his manager to buy the houses. Oh, you need this. You need a tax shelter. And he did. And I was evicted with 24 hours notice. So let's go back to how my father became this way, why he became this way, and how this ties into how I became a dominatrix. My father had a lot of anger, being an Italian-American, facing a lot of criticism, a lot of discrimination. And a lot of Americans don't know that Italians were lower than any ethnic group on the totem pole, especially during World War II, during Hitler. And in particular, my family ended up in America because of Hitler. When the fascista and the Gestapo took over Italy, and the fascist movement swept through Italy, my family saw horrific crimes. One particular story was my great-grandfather had walked into a barbershop, and the fascists had walked in, and there were like 5 guys lined up in barber chairs, and they just came in and shot each one of them in the back of the head. The blood started rolling down the sidewalk of the Italian cobblestone streets, and my great-grandfather came home and said, "That's it, we're going to America." So my father had this big kind of hard on his whole life. You know, he got his master's degree. He became very distinguished, but there was always a thread of anger, and there was always a thread, and I didn't really know this because my parents didn't talk about it. All I knew is that we weren't to speak Italian in the house because we had to become Americanized, although they didn't change our last name, which happened to a lot of Italians. My parents did very much Americanize. My brother's Glenn, my sister's Jennifer, and I'm Pamela. They tried to drop as much of the Italian as possible so that we could integrate. We had just become white in any census data. If I look back at my immigration records of my great-grandparents, they were all listed as mulatto. And so there is a very angry thread that runs through many Italian Americans at that time that came up, baby boomers during World War II, that they had to prove something. They had to become just like all American white bread men, become CEOs, business owners, and distinguished members of society, joining all sorts of civic organizations, which my father did. He was very politically minded as well as philanthropically minded. And looking back now, I just thought he was a great guy. I see now that there was an absolute path and a mission, almost a vendetta against what people said he was. I remember my parents saying, if you ever go to a friend's house and they use the word Italian, get out of the house immediately. I didn't know what it meant, but the discrimination that my parents had faced was far worse than anything I did growing up in 1970s white bread Hershey, Pennsylvania, although I was kind of the darkest kid in my class. So with that said, it kind of could explain to you how some of what happened, and a lot of this, I'm writing my next book, which is going to be the Salacious Tell-All, and it will have much more detail about this, but I think it's important for people to understand why and how a person can become so angry and can become so determined to dispel and lose an ethnic stereotype, and this was definitely playing into it. So as I was in college in the 1990s, I had quit college. I had gone to college in Pittsburgh, quit college when my mother got sick. I became her medical caregiver. She passed from cancer, and then years later, I went back. So I was late going back to college. And I took a job as a bartender, as I mentioned, in Smoke in Englewood, New Jersey. Now, what was cool about Smoke was this was during the 1990s. The Sopranos had just hit kind of the social forefront. It had become part of the lexicon of everything that was happening in America and in pop culture, let alone I was at ground zero of it. So, for example, while the restaurant was in Englewood, New Jersey, and a lot of the Sopranos actors were coming into our restaurant, very high-end restaurant, very kind of bougie. Jon Stewart from The Daily Show was coming in, Aidan Quinn, Madonna's boyfriend in Desperately Seeking Susan, Stevie Wonder, and a lot of the vaudeville actors and old 1940s singers, because the Screen Actors Guild retirement home was right down the street at that time. So it was a really amazing time to be in New Jersey, be bartending, and be at the forefront of this scene. So Smoke was, so I was going to say that when we would leave the bar, or we would close the restaurant at the end of the night. Again, I'm the only female employed in the restaurant. The servers were all men, and sometimes they'd like to have a cocktail afterwards. Well, the only place that was open was Satin Dolls over in, I think it was Hackensack. It was just past Fort Lee. It was Hackensack, New Jersey. The irony was, it was a strip club, and that's where the guys would like to take me for a drink, and they loved it. They all had, big laughs because they enjoyed buying me lap dances. And you have to remember, our restaurant was a pool house, so if somebody ordered, a $7,000, $10,000, $15,000 bottle of wine, our tip outs were insane. The money that we were making was utterly insane. So we would go over to Satin Dolls and have a drink. But the irony of this was, or the tie-in is that Satin Dolls strip club was the Bada Bing Club. It's where they were filming the Bada Bing, which was Tony Soprano's kind of storefront or behind the scenes for his capos in The Sopranos. So we were there, and their filming stuff was all there, and it was kind of cool. So, again, I'm still a very innocent. All of this leads up to me becoming this hardened dominatrix. But bear in mind, I'm still my nice, innocent Catholic girl from Hershey, Pennsylvania. Both my parents are from New Jersey, so I'm very familiar with the area. We had a summer house in New Jersey. And I am new to smoke as a bartender. Very prestigious position, by the way. In northern Jersey, New York City, a bartender, let alone a head bartender, is a very prestigious position. It's usually a very pretty girl, and she has a strong command of presence. She's able to speak to the higher clientele and build a business, not unlike any other, like a hairdresser, doctor, lawyer, whatever it is, regular patients. You're building your regular clientele, and these are high-rolling clientele. So this was a very important position, and I loved it. But I was selling I had like a 7-drawer humidor behind the bar. I sold single malt scotches and cognacs and trying to learn the wine list. It was incredible. It was a real crash course in bouge, in upper crust lifestyle. I remember my top shelf liqueur was a cognac, and it was called Pre-Phylloxera. And I think it was about $12,000 a glass. Only George, the owner of our restaurant, was able to pour it. You had to get on a ladder to get this decanter. And it was only ordered by either rappers or a sports famous athlete, or somebody who had really something to prove. But I'd seen it poured a few times. Pre-Phylloxera cognac was, I guess there was an aphid that ate through the cognac vineyards in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this particular cognac was made pre-phylloxera, before this aphid ate through those vineyards. So it was very coveted, very bougie, very expensive, and it was a big deal. So that's the type of bar that it was. So now that I'm giving you the background on what this looked like, Smoke was a tiny restaurant, very elegant, again, looked like a speakeasy. I remember an old jazz singer from the 1940s. She was still alive. Her name was Kitty Kalin. And they had an old record player in the back, and when she would come in, they would put on her records, and she would sit in the back, and it was just a really cool thing to see, as well as, again, all the vaudeville actors and actresses would come in. So the guys come up to me one night, and they say, "Put this in the front window behind your bar." And I said, "What is it?" They said, "It's our next smoker." And I said, "Well, what's a smoker?" And they all looked at each other, winked and grinned, and I knew there was I wasn't in on the joke now. I was like the butt of the joke, and I was like, "What's a smoker?" They're like, "You'll see." So I'm reading the poster, and it basically says, it's like a $700 a plate dinner. It's private. It's exclusive. It's, there's only a certain amount of limited seats available. And it was something like, a 7-course meal where the gentleman would come in and they would have the opportunity to taste certain dishes, certain single malt scotch, and certain wines. They were featuring with a sommelier doing a presentation, and then they would be bringing in some lingerie that the men could buy for their wives. I was like, "Oh, that's nice. That's so lovely." The night of the smoker came, and I was told to wear something particularly sexy, and there was an air of like tension, excitement, anticipation in the restaurant. I remember the head chef Michael coming out, and he was being very particular about how to serve this, there was just a lot of buzz in the restaurant that I hadn't seen before. And all of a sudden, George, the owner, and several of the maitre d', I can't remember his name right now, and several of the servers went up and they drew the blinds and pulled the drapes in the front of the restaurant. And they began to hold the door open, and they're all looking out on the street. And 3 limousines pull up from Scores. And if you watch my previous episodes of my podcast, you'll understand how Scores later ends up playing a big role in my life and how I ended up in phone sex and then domination. The 3 limousines pull up with bodyguards, and they begin letting the women out of the limousines. And they get out and they start walking in, and the bodyguards escort them. These women walk into the restaurant past my bar. Now I'm like 5'5.5". I'm in 4-inch stilettos behind the bar, and I was in really good shape. I was in my late 20s at that point. These women walk in, and I'm like this. I'd never seen anything like this. These were the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in my life. They were already 5'6", 5'9", 5'8", 5'9", 5'11", but they are in 6-inch platform stilettos. So they're like, I'm looking up to them. They are tiny. They are fit. They have long wigs and extensions and the most beautiful bodies. And black women, white women, Latina, every race, creed, color, ethnicity, and they're just walking in one. And I was a little girl who played with Barbies. This was like watching a stream of actual Barbies walk right past me. And they smelled so good, and they were dressed so pretty. So each of the women gets assigned to a table. And now they close the doors, and the bodyguards come in, and they're all lined up standing at the front. And each of the women gets assigned to a table. They're taking off their furs, and now they're revealing their garters, their pantyhose, their glimmering, shimmering outfits, bedazzled, thongs and bodysuits and bikinis. And I was absolutely, it was a sensory moment for me I will never forget. It was intoxicating. I was equal parts shocked, mesmerized, and seduced by the whole scene. So what ends up happening is the men, the high roller men, the clients, the restaurant clients start coming in, and they begin coming in, and they've got assigned seats. They're all looking for their name cards, and they sit down. These men indulge in this insanely beautiful first-class meal of wine, cognac, single malt scotch, the most beautiful meats and pastas and seafood, all of it. And then they finish it off with, I can't remember if it was Cohiba cigars, if it was Arturo Fuente, I can't remember, Macanudo, I don't remember what the cigars were, but they finished off with cigars. And then the girls who had been kind of walking through while they're eating, each one of them, a bodyguard takes their hand, puts them up on the table, they're standing up on the table. And now one by one, the music's playing, the music's blaring, and they begin stripping off their lingerie while these men are throwing thousands of dollars at them, buying off the lingerie from the dancers, which I guess correlated to you can buy your wife beautiful lingerie and take it home to her. Okay. Gross. But okay, that's what it was. So this is how they got away with doing something like this in this family restaurant, that the guys would come in and bring their wives. The wives had no idea what was going on. And I could tell you a story or two about some things that went on in the wine room and the bathroom downstairs with a few celebrities, but I think I will save that for a later date. Nonetheless, this moment of me seeing these women, seeing the power they had, watching these wealthy men throw $100 bills at them for hours, and the stacks of cash that these women left with, the stacks of cash in their garters, stuffed in their boots, just hanging from them, because the guys are putting the $100 bills like all around their thongs and everything, and then of course the clothes all came off, and it was just money, sex, and just house of ill repute all over the place. But this is where something I often talk about, how men, their first early experience with a dominant woman will hardlock something in their psyche where they become forever addicted to that intoxicating mix of a woman, a strong, beautiful woman, overpowering them, dominating them, telling them what to do. By the same token, when this smoker happened and these glamazons from Scores were parading in front of me, first in thongs, then fully naked, something hard locked in my psyche. This is where the power is. This is where the money is. This is it. And of course, while I didn't set out to do it, when my father ended up, now we go back to the other story, when my father ended up bankrupting me, and I stumbled upon that ad in the New York Times for Scores, looking to open their chat hostess division, their online Playmate webcam model division, I immediately remembered, think, that hard lock of that moment of seeing that intoxicating power, that beautiful display of what a woman in her ultimate divine feminine, the power she can wield, the things she can do, these powerful men that were at her feet. And I was like, why not? How can I not do this? If I can get just a piece of that, I want it. And I did. So there's so much more I can tell you. My father growing up, so my father's born in the Marcy Projects in 1941 in Brooklyn. Marcy Projects is where Jay-Z sings about that he grew up in the Marcy Projects. Extremely dangerous. They were equally as dangerous in 1941, if not even more so. I remember my grandfather would carry around a bayonet from this is the story. My grandfather would carry around a bayonet from the French and Indian War, and that's how he would ward off the neighbors. And I remember being told the stories of how I remember being at Thanksgiving dinner. My papa, we called him Papa Cappetta, Danny Cappetta, and he didn't have any teeth. I have pictures of him on my Instagram. I'll have to show you guys. He was as big around as he was tall. He was beautiful. He looked like Rudolph Valentino when he was younger, and then older, he looked like your typical Italian, like Chef Boyardee grandpa. And I remember Papa sitting at the Thanksgiving table at some point in the 80s talking about the ferrets. And I was like, Papa, how do you even know what a ferret is? And he's like, you don't know. When the Iceman would bring up the ice, 6 stories to our flat. And I was like, what? The Iceman? I didn't know what an ice box was. The Iceman had to carry a big block of ice. He said, and we'd have to chase the rats away, so we would get the ferrets to eat the rats. What? Nice little to a kid in the 1980s, like, this is like horrific. I didn't even know ferrets could eat rats. I didn't know a ferret in the hierarchy of rodents. I didn't know the ferret is at the top of who knew? And who knew the ferrets at the top of the food chain, and my grandfather housed them to eat the rats in the Marcy Projects? Who knew all this? But anyway, so my father has an uncle. His name was Joe Rivers. And I actually, just in case you think I'm lying, I validated all of this information with a gentleman who I met from a Vice.com article about the mob. This gentleman's name is Christian Cipollini, and you can find him on Instagram at Gangland. What is it? Gangland Legends. He's on TikTok and Instagram at Gangland Legends, and he was able to verify all this. So my father has an uncle named Joe Rivers, a.k.a. Giuseppe Salesi, who was a capo. He was a made man in the Gambino crime family. He also worked for Anastasia and Santo Trafficante. My father's uncle, Joe Rivers, Giuseppe Salesi, was the one that was sent to Havana, Cuba. If you've ever seen Godfather 3 or Godfather 2, my father's uncle was the one that was sent to Havana, Cuba to open the gambling tables and created that whole economy up until Fidel Castro nixed the whole thing and shut it down. And then the mob moved to Miami, and that's where he stayed doing his thing. But I remember my father telling me that Giuseppe Salesi, uncle, this Joe Rivers, my father did not have much interaction with him, that he would show up at funerals, standing way in the back, showing up after the funeral had begun. He would be in like a long, dark trench coat, just like you see in the movies. He would have dark sunglasses on, but he had to steer clear of the family for protective reasons, not be seen, not be recognized. So my father grew up my father's born in Brooklyn, raised in Paterson, New Jersey. And my mother's from Paterson, New Jersey. My father from Buffalo Ave. My mother from 424 East 21st Street in Paterson. Now, if you know anything about the Mafia, the mob, it's all out of that area. For those of you who like the Real Housewives franchise, you'll know that the Manzos, Dina Manzo and Caroline Manzo, they married into a family that was affiliated with the mob, which was the Manzo family. They owned the Brownstone in Paterson. And my father has a great story to tell about Tiny Manzo, Caroline and Dina's father-in-law, which would be her husband's father, and how he passed away. Actually, I'll just tell it real quick. So the story is that Tiny Manzo was doing deals in the garment district in New York. And if you know anything about the mob, they have certain areas that they control. And if you don't give them a piece of it or you're not approved, you're going to be in trouble. And Tiny Manzo kept selling garments out of his car in the area that was controlled by a certain affiliation branch of the Mafia. And after being warned 3 times, they told him the next time is going to be it. And so the story goes, he was found, and I believe this was in the 1960s or 70s. You can Google it. It's in Wikipedia. He was found in the trunk of his car, covered in the garments that he was selling, and they cut off his member and put it in his mouth. And that's how his family found him in the trunk of his, I think it was like a brand new Cadillac or something. Then my father knows this guy. Or knew this guy. So, and my father always said that, like Frank Angelica, like all of these guys that my father grew up with, one of whom is Joe Pistone, a.k.a. Donnie Brasco. I have all of these photos. I'm going to have my podcast editors here, the guys that are filming this, I'm going to have them put up some pictures of my father with Joe Pistone. Joe Pistone was Donnie Brasco. And he is the one that Johnny Depp played him in Donnie Brasco, the movie, opposite Al Pacino. And my father grew up with him. Now, Joe Pistone, again, all of these guys were entrenched in the mob, but Joe Pistone in particular actually became an FBI informant and turned evidence against the Mafia. So even up until the picture that I'm going to show you was an Italian-American, the Unico organization. My father had Joe come to Hershey and receive an award from the Unico Italian-American organization. Even up until that time, his family is very much kind of like they don't use their real names. It's kind of very undercurrent because there's still some protective orders in place for the Pistone family based on the fact that Joe was an FBI informant. But these were all of the characters that my father grew up with and that he swirled in. And I remember one time when I was working at the bar at Smoke, there was an older guy with a thick head of hair, and he used to come in all the time, and he was always hitting on me. And he was really old, and his name was Ray Nichols. Ray Nicholas or Ray Nichols. And he owned, not unlike Tony Soprano, a trash refuse, disposal company. He was in the trash business. And I remember at one point, everybody just knew me as Pamela from Hershey, Pennsylvania. And I said, no, my father's from here. And he said, well, what's your father's name? And I said, Don Cappetta. He said, your father is Donato? And I said, yes. And he said, so that makes your uncle Frank, your uncle Angelo, that makes Frank Cappetta your uncle? And I was like, mm-hmm. His entire demeanor changed. Everything changed. And he said, will you tell your father I said hello? And he paid for his drink. He left me an extra large tip, and he left. And I think that was the moment that I realized that there was a little more going on to my father, my uncle, my family story. And as I deep dove everything on Ancestry.com, and I'm finding out that our name wasn't Cappetta, it was Caputo. Before we left Italy. I'm not really sure how it turned into Cappetta, which I have to say Cappetta, when I went to Italy, they were like, "Che vuoi?" When I went in, they said, "You're pronouncing your name Cappetta," and they had discussed, and they said, "The name is Cappetta, Cappetta." So, okay, so I'm pronouncing my last name wrong. But there's so much to the story. Now, Joe Rivers is on my father's mother's side, which is the Palermo Pernice side. But I'm still trying to pull apart and diagnose and kind of digest and investigate all of this, because I believe not just breaking the generational cycle of physical, verbal, emotional abuse is important. I need to understand, what was it that happened to my family over in Italy? What was it that drove them to really escape? Was it the fascista? Was that just my mother's side? Was that the story? What led to my family leaving, and why am I uncovering my grandfather was arrested for, or my great-grandfather was arrested for a heroin bust in 1921. I didn't even know they had heroin in 1921, and he was sent to Rikers. I found his mugshot. So there's a lot more that I need to uncover, and I just felt that this was a really good way, the mafia and the sex industry, because recently I have begun talking to escort agencies, applying for jobs on a site called Sexy Jobs. I am infiltrating, not unlike Joe Pistone, Donnie Brasco turned informant. I'm investigating the sex industry because a lot of these guys, mob and as well as just corrupt guys in Europe, young ones, are breaking into the OF industry, and they're managing young women. They are managing escorts. And if you are familiar at all with the 304 TikTok, go check it out, 304 TikTok. A lot of these girls are independent sex workers, and they need someone fighting for them. They need someone being their mouthpiece. They need someone exposing the men, like the ones that I'm describing, that are behind the scenes, that are controlling the escorts, that are the pimps, that are involved in human trafficking. And if there's anything that this podcast accomplishes, it's to bring a voice to these women, and hopefully in future episodes I will be bringing them on and getting them to tell their stories and becoming more human. It's not just the dirty girl that you think is, living in New York City in squalor. It's your next door neighbor. It's the girl you went to high school with. You'd be surprised who's escorting. It's the soccer mom who's bored or wants extra money for herself. So I'm trying to tie all of this in, because it's not just a 1920s, 1940s, 1950s, 60s, 70s mentality with the Mafia, or the 80s, 90s with the Sopranos. It's happening today. It's real. And I want to bring some exposure to it. So I recently encountered a guy out of Houston who owns some private sex clubs, and we had a series of conversations. I was doing so well with him, thinking that I was coming to work with him, until I couldn't keep my mouth shut. Finally, he said a few things, and I put him in his place, and I spoke my mind, and he was like, he was coming to Vegas to meet me, and I was going to find out where the clubs were and how they run them and get the whole inside scoop. And then I just blew it. At the 11th hour, I blew it. So I'm sure he'll be listening, because he knows that I do a podcast. And although I'm not going to mention your name, just know that I'm coming for you. And then I have all my notes and everything I've exposed. Everything that I learned will be exposed in future episodes. Try and put a hit on me. My own father tried to, and he couldn't. And that's the episode. If you're interested in any more of these stories, if there's something that I touched on that you'd like me to go further in depth about, tell me, whether it's on Spotify, underneath my Saint to Siren podcast. You can make comments of what you'd like to hear, the questions you have. You're also welcome to write questions or ask me questions underneath my YouTube videos. Also Saint to Siren, the Findom Masterclass. My Instagram is also Saint to Siren, as well as my TikTok. I wouldn't ask me specific questions on anything adult sex or 304 related on TikTok. I would stick to the podcast, the Spotify, and Instagram and YouTube. But I'm always looking for feedback. I'm always looking for questions. The reason I did this episode was because you had requested that I go further into how I ended up in this life. And I think it was a foregone conclusion, given my family history, that I ended up here. The irony and the picture that I will post of my father in the 1970s with the Playboy bunny sitting on his lap with a cigarette and a pinky ring, I think it was a foregone conclusion that the thread of mafia and criminal activity and sex work would all eventually find their way into my lexicon. So my book is available on Amazon. I think it's free on Kindle. They're scalping it on eBay for 3 times the price, so better off to go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon to find it. And thank you for tuning in. I will be recording episode 4 next week, so your feedback is super important so I know what you want covered. Bye-bye.